Hello and welcome to Money Marketing Wired. I'm Sam Brobeck and we're going to be looking at auto-enrollment and the SME market today. It's so far so good for auto-enrollment, but we've had the easy bit so far. Medium-sized firms have already begun auto-enrolling staff, but the pressure point really comes next year. From the end of 2015, hundreds of thousands of the smallest employers will be hitting their staging dates each month. For these employers with limited resources, streamlined processes will be key. So what are the challenges for payroll and middleware firms? How competitive are fees? And is there a danger of a capacity crunch in the market? Will employers be forced into using Nest? And are there enough advisors to cope with demand? Before we get into all that, I'd like to introduce our panel. From our sponsor, Now Pensions, we have Martin Olive. Joining him, we have Henry Tapper from the Pensions Playpen and Kevin Hart from Sage. Money Marketing Wired is live and interactive, so if you've got a question for the panel, please use the box on your screen. Or if Twitter is your preferred medium, please use the hashtag MMWired, and we'll get the questions to our panel. I'd like to come to Martin first. If you could just talk to us about where we are now, what kind of employers are sort of preparing for auto-enrollment, and how actually prepared they are.
Well, we're fast moving towards, as you said, the beginning of next year when we really get into the SME market, where we're talking about employers with employee numbers down to about 50. If we look back at what happened this year, our records would show that typically we get employers looking to come to us round about 2 to 3 months before staging. I think the worrying thing at the moment is that certainly during September and the first part of October, the employers coming to us are already either in their month of staging or have missed it. About 50% of those would be in that category. So in terms of looking forward to what might happen next year, that quite possibly would get worse. And I think the even more worrying thing is that there's a lack of understanding about what staging date actually means, because obviously these people have to postpone, and even though they've reached their staging date, they're not aware they actually have to communicate with their employees. So they're already really in a breach situation. So preparedness is a problem.
Is that the experience everyone else has got, Henry?
Very much so. The difficulty is awareness. And this feeling that their postponement date is their staging date, which means that they're leaving things 3 months too late. The pension regulator has been very good at pointing out to people that actually your staging date is your staging date, not the point at which you postpone to, which might be 3 months later.
This one we wanted for Kevin. People always talk about streamlining auto-enrollment, why it's so important. Maybe you could explain a little bit about that.
I think the streamlining, Sam, is really, if you look at go back to the awareness piece, we have to get through the awareness and education piece for customers. And we found that we've invested sort of thousands of hours in customers to help understand that. But because this is all new to them, and there's obviously the threat of penalty payments as well upon them, there's a lot of education, and through that they're really relying very much upon payroll to assist them in meeting those obligations. And we've found really fundamentally it's the power of 5 for them, is they really want really good preparation tools to help them understand and everything that's required in leading up to that. They really want to be able to do the assessment at literally of a click of a button. They don't want to be involved in manually undertaking the assessment. They really want to be able to then have ease of communications to their employees, because that's really difficult. And if you get the wrong communication, again, there are issues with the regulators for that. And then they need to be able to, once they've got up and running with their pension, it's then sending the pension data. That has to be done on a timely basis. There's lots of rules and regulations. And finally, then there's this whole umbrella of compliance and what the regulator wants to see going forwards. As Martin said, staging, in some respects, infers almost a phased process, but it's actually a pivotal point by which they had to have complied with the regulator. So, for example, at Sage, we've streamlined that all into a process built within the products that gives them all that guidance. And together, for example, like with Now, we've been running sort of seminars to actually help people understand that, and particularly also the advisors as to what's required.
I think understanding is right, because the need for streamlined processes is partly because employers don't recognise there are lots of processes, as has been demonstrated by them coming late to staging. They think that they can just turn to a pension provider, set their scheme up, and that's it. So moving forward into next year and beyond, streamlined processes so employers can quickly get set up are going to be absolutely critical if we're not all to fall over.
I think it's a great. I mean, if we harness, we look back. If I mentioned the three-letter acronym of RTI, the real-time information experience taught us all a lot as actually about getting the clean data. And again, small businesses are concerned about the punitive impacts from the regulator, but also they rely upon us as the industries to many respects to do it for them. And they won't actually do anything until possibly the latest point they need to do that.
I think we've got to be careful not to put too much blame on the employers, because I think there's a bit of blame that we can take for ourselves. I mean, you mentioned RTI, and I think that really got in the way of a lot of preparedness among the payroll side. From our point of view, in terms of advisory, we've been shouting from the rooftops about the need for a common data standard, for instance, for the last 5 or 6 years. But effectively, I think a lot of providers now are only now realising just how important the common data standard is. Totally. And I think advisors need to take their share of any problems that arise, in as much as we're not always as quick to help our employers or employer clients as we should be. So I don't think there's any scope for us to blame the great British employer.
I think it's a very good point, Henry. I think I'm just trying to illustrate that it's as Martin said, it's awareness and education. And I think what we've really done more of late is we're getting more joined up as an industry to make sure there's a really good cascade and sharing and engagement. Today being hopefully a good example.
You mentioned payroll before, and it's one of the words that, as longer auto-enrollment goes on, people say payroll, payroll, payroll. Can you sort of explain maybe where payroll providers are? I mean, are they ready for this surge in demand that we're expecting?
Great question. They are in varying degrees. Those that service the micro businesses, naturally, with as Martin was saying, that's coming further down the line. There's probably a degree of readiness further down the line for some of those. I can really more aptly speak on Sage's behalf, because we've obviously had to service a multitude from almost sort of small corporates down through medium to now small size businesses. So the readiness has had to be in there. But the wider market, there are differing stages of readiness.
Yeah, I think what do you mean by readiness, really? If you're talking about payroll providers that can do the whole piece from assessment all the way through to managing the communications, like the Sage auto-enrollment model, then there's very few. However, the situation is a lot better than it was even sort of 3 or 6 months ago, in that most payroll providers will at least do the assessment and categorisation of workers.
We find this. We've just issued a survey to 50, I believe you're one of them, payroll software providers. We've got back about 25, and quite a few of the ones we haven't got back have written to us and said, we simply haven't staged anyone yet and not intending to do so for some time. Payroll tends to be the sort of business where you don't invest heavily until you have to. So it's good to see the larger payrolls, such as yourselves and Iris and so on, who are ready. We worry that some aren't ready, and I think this leads naturally into sort of issues about what do you do if you're with a smaller payroll who isn't ready right now, and what alternatives there are. And hopefully we'll have a discussion about those kind of things too. Yeah.
We'll come back to that. In terms of choice for those smaller employers as we get in the next couple of years, and we've seen pension providers setting minimum requirements for the kind of schemes they take on and flat fees, that kind of thing. Is there a danger that SME employers are only left with Nest? Martin, I think it's probably an obvious one for you.
Well, there's a danger that employers will think that there's going to be a wider choice than there actually is. I think everybody's agreed that most of the traditional providers will be pulling out of the marketplace, or certainly pulling back more than they have been. Strong evidence, certainly from advisors, that I think 93% of advisors in a survey that we recently did said product providers are cherry picking. But it won't just be Nest. Now Pensions has always been in a position where we are more than happy to accept every employer, no matter how many, the number of employees, no matter what the size of the contributions, the average contributions, or how transient the workforce is. ATP in Denmark, our parent, have always adopted the approach, and of course have provided pensions to everybody in Denmark, and that's what we want to do voluntarily over here. So we will do our best to soak up the capacity in there and provide a solution for employers. But we need more providers in the market to a certain extent because we can't do it all ourselves.
Do you think there's then just actually employers, they've heard of Nest because it's a government-backed scheme and they just kind of think, well, that's all I'm going to do, and they don't actually, as you say, they need the advisors to come in and give them that range?
Yes, ideally they do, and again, I think that's the other issue, is how many advisors are actually in the auto-enrolment market space. I think we've received employer schemes from sort of 500 or 600 different advisor firms, but that's still 11,000 and odd that write pensions business that haven't done business with us. So we want to raise our profile.
There's a big public awareness issue. I was talking to Hugh Pym, who's the senior BBC economics reporter, and he was under the impression, this was only 6 months ago, that Nest was the only fruit and that was the only organisation you could auto-enrol with. It worries me that if we don't get some form of common data standard, we may find ourselves with payrolls who simply say we'll only deal with X or Y or Z. And if Nest is the only one that they'll deal with, then inevitably business will be channeled down that line, and the impact on that will be less choice for consumers. A recent TPR survey suggested 65% of employers wanted to make an active choice. And secondly, we'll end up with a capacity problem at Nest, which really will be severe, because no matter what they say, there are 1.2 million employers still to stage, and that really is beyond the scope of any organisation.
I'll come back to data point in a second, but if we could stick with the advisor bit for the minute. You mentioned, possible lack of capacity there. I mean, Henry, maybe you're best placed to say this, but is there an appetite for advisors, the IFAs, to take on the auto-enrolment work?
It varies. I mean, you've got some very good IFAs out there like Martin Bamford of Informed Choice, who have purposely walked away from auto-enrolment and said, this is not what we're going to do. And they've handed their business on to other advisors. And there's a hardcore of very good financial advisors out there who will be dealing with some SMEs all the way down to the one-man micros, one-woman micros. Our worry is just the sheer numbers. If this was a market which looked 2 to 3 times what the market looked like 5 years ago, yes, we could probably cope. The difficulty is that it's 20 or 30 times that size. And what we're going to have to see is recruitment from outside of the industry, possibly from the accountancy profession, or payroll people stepping up to the market and doing it themselves, or we may find that there's an influx of a new kind of unauthorised advisor who's going to come in and start doing some of this work from a place we don't know, because we're in uncharted territory.
You mentioned accountants, and it's an interesting area. I mean, some recent TPR data showed that the smaller the employer was, the more likely they would turn to their accountant rather than an advisor for help for auto-enrolment. So I just wondered if you're seeing that kind of come through, and are accountants entering the space and sort of taking new ground, really?
I think they're just starting to. I think we were a little surprised at how long it's taken them to recognise that if there's any sector that has to be affected by auto-enrolment, and you can see that either as a positive opportunity or a threat, it is accountancy firms with bureau services. They have to do something. If they're not gearing themselves up for auto-enrolment, their clients will look elsewhere. But I think as we've got into, we're now moving into the bureau space, into the SME micro-employer market, and I think they're just beginning to twig. So, I think they're starting to respond to the fact that they need to take control of their customer base, and also almost sort of make sure that they are talking to them about how they want to provide payroll services to them as clients.
But I think
the last thing a bureau wants to do is have 100 clients where they're all doing different things, which means that's 100 different payroll processes every month or every week for a bureau. So how do they streamline their processes?
We've seen about 450 now employers come through the pension playpen and make inquiries one way or another. And they're going back and talking to their advisors and accountants and saying, look, there is choice in the market. We've seen it. Yeah. How can we go and make the correct decision? I'm convinced that employers do want more than Nest. I'm convinced they want more than Nest than now, actually, for that matter. I think there are a wide number of different propositions, everything from your SIPs on one side through to, as you say, Nest, and now it's the big master trusts, and a lot in between. And I think if we lose that kind of texture, that granularity to the market, I think what we're going to end up with is a lot of disillusionment among employers who 5-6 years' time down the line will be asking themselves, well, why did we take that decision? Why did we choose Nest? Why didn't we go and have a look elsewhere? It worries me from an advisory point of view, Sam. It worries me that a lot of advisors themselves have difficulty researching the market. And I think one of the problems is how do you actually research the market? How do you get all this information in front of clients? And most important, how do those clients make informed choices on the information that's presented to them? Because let's face it, the OFT's report suggested that we have very poor purchasing power within the employers themselves.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting aspect with the conjoint with accountants and bookkeepers that you mentioned, like advisors and trusted advisors. I mean, from what we see, accountants, we've got a plethora of data on there, but highly trusted advisors, most of which will have a relationship with an IFA because of the services they provide at both at a consumer and a business level to their clientele. However, the question then is, as we both colleagues touched on, is it the right advisor? Is that advisor a pensions experienced advisor? So our accountants are actually linking up with the right advisors to work with, to be able to deliver that overall service. And we're certainly seeing, very much to Martin's point as well, is that they're operating bureaus. We've got many, Sage bureaus, Sage-enabled accounting bureaus. And for them, it is quite complex when they're servicing hundreds of clients, with all different pensions arrangements. So they need to have their advisors, and when we've been working with advisors as we are, they are then looking to say, okay, who do we need to engage with as accountants? So that it feels like there's a bit of, to your point, Henry, a bit of sort of almost matchmaking required.
I'll just jump in there because we've got a sort of question on that topic. This is from Joanna. She says she's an accountant. She's not sure where she stands on giving the advice. She says she's qualified with ACCA, but doesn't believe she can help her clients decide which scheme without an IFA.
Can I answer that question, Joanna? I'm really glad you asked it because the ICAEW are supposed to be putting out a statement on this very shortly. We've had a lot of conversations with the regulator about this, and we've even spoken to the DWP, and it's absolutely clear. Both the pension regulator and the FCA made a joint statement in March which said that the choice of pension for the employer is an unregulated activity. And advisors can actually talk to employers about that choice without fear of reprisal from any regulator. It's when you start talking to the employees and explaining to them what their options are that you need to be regulated.
And I think there's a lot of confusion in the advisory community around that as well. Where we're seeing some really successful operations is actually with regulated advisors setting up non-regulated business for the sort of transactional process of fulfilling auto-enrolment solutions for small businesses. And we'll see more and more of that amongst really good commercially minded advisory organisations as we go forward, I think.
I mean, interestingly, although we're regulated as actuaries, the pension playpen is an unregulated advisor, and we provide that kind of back office service for accountants and IFAs so that they can make informed decisions on behalf of their clients, so that the clients can make those informed decisions for themselves. And we think this is where the market's got to go. We've got to start looking much more at new technologies to enable people to do these things quickly, cheaply, and thoroughly.
Now, we touched on data standards before. As I understand it, PAPDIS and Origo are working on a solution, but as yet there isn't sort of agreement among providers and the industry. I don't know who's best to talk on this, but how big of a risk is this? And why haven't we got there yet?
Do you want to start, Henry?
Well, I mean, it's great to have two.
It's a Mexican wave.
There's two friends in the room on this because I Friends of Auto Enrolment, which has been chairing some of the PAPDIS meetings lately, has got right behind PAPDIS. PAPDIS is a common data standard which hopefully will become, if you like, the VHS of the future. I mean, you wouldn't have 50 different sockets for a kettle But that's basically what we have to have at the moment. So what we need to do is just create one socket, one plug going forward. And that's the only way I think we'll get through 2016-17. What's really great is that PAPDIS is driven by payroll. Sage has been fantastic in this. It's been driven by providers, and no provider has done more than now. And it's also driven by advisors who recognise the need for something which is better than what we have at the moment. So on that basis, there's a lot of collaboration, and it's quite different. But the best thing of all is that instead of Origo saying, OK, well, we're the data standard people, they've come right in behind this and said, well, we are the data standard people, but we'll work inside of this whole pensions bid, PAPDIS scenario. And for that reason, I think that PAPDIS really has got legs, as we'll see over the next couple of weeks.
I think the building on that with Henry is absolutely right from a technical perspective and the engagement that's required across the industry. It will take time for it to be, I think, supported by the notable providers. But if you look at it from the customer perspective, PAPDIS, Origo, the customer doesn't care. Yes, and actually from an advisory perspective, I would suggest the advisor just needs to be able to put faith in the appropriate providers that this works. To your question earlier, Sam, about seamlessly. Yeah, so if a payroll customer would expect us just to press the button and all of the HMRC RTI happens. They expect exactly the same with pensions. Yeah. Well, whereas to your point, there's only one kettle, there's only one HMRC, but there's a multitude of pension providers. So common data standard is one key element, but the way they behave and work as pension providers, because they have different rules for joiners, for regular reporting, for opt-outs, and business rules around that. So the data standard will go a long way towards helping. It's then the different electricity that goes through the plug to make sure the kettle still boils quickly and effectively. So we've still got a lot of work to do in the industry, and I think the PAPDIS piece has galvanised the industry into action.
Well, just not particularly on the technicalities of PAPDIS. That's certainly not me. Nothing sensible about it at all. But certainly this whole business of streamlined approaches needing to work. I think the worst possible scenario for providers such as ourselves is if employers are not able to self-serve when they're looking to implement their scheme when they get to staging date, then we will get snowed under with calls to call centre. We'll have to employ lots and lots of people, which in a low-cost delivery environment that we are, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think the more that advisors can help, and the more that payroll providers can provide a total solution, the more that will ensure the SMEs and micro-employer.
Which we're, for example, we've been now definitely working on a more streamlined setup process, because actually we can talk about the electricity flowing through the kettle, but if you can't even get the kettle on the shelf and get them set up in the first place, it's like a non-issue. So actually it's crucial that we can get these
we need
advisors.
an API. We need an API behind every single sale, so effectively it's a straight-through process. You press the button and off you go.
Well, before we get into too much,
sorry, I'm getting.
We've got another question come in from Paul, back to the advisor and regulation angle. He says the fact that auto-enrolment isn't an authorised activity leaves it wide open to having advisors with no experience coming into the market to make money and employers losing out. Anyone want to comment on that?
I guess that's potentially an issue, particularly as your traditional pensions advisor, if they're not involved in employee benefits, has no real experience in payroll and how middleware and how it all slots together. So yes, to an extent, but I think they'll find it difficult to make money unless they're really in it seriously and really get to understand all those processes, because SMEs and micro-employers aren't going to be able to pay an awful lot of money. So I think reasonable value for a decent level of interaction for an advisor will always be welcome and needs to be encouraged.
I think there's a really important point to make here about advisory business models, and that is that most advisors will not make very much money out of auto-enrolment, full stop. If it washes its face, it's doing fine. What you're creating is a bank of clients who know you to be competent and to be on their side. And that gives you the opportunity to do work for them which is valuable, and you can really use your skills, wealth management or business protection. You can penetrate quite deeply into their business and provide other services such as SIPs and wraps and whatever. And all these things happen because you've created that relationship with the employer through auto-enrolment. Employers who value advisors are going to remember that.
Yeah, indeed.
You mentioned the kind of the cost side of it, where the money is. I guess maybe advisors don't see the money to be gained there. In terms of what SMEs want, a lot of people seem to think, well, all they want to do is comply. Is there any evidence that actually they want to go a bit further? They want something a bit more exciting, and then maybe you've got some opportunities around that?
The difficulty here is that there's no money in the pensions at the moment. What we've found with workplace pensions, which we set up for stakeholders, is that when the plans actually start getting worth something, people start valuing them. So it's more a risk, actually, and the risk is that people don't pay any attention to the decision they took in 2014, 15, 16. And then by 2020, these things are quite valuable, and people start asking questions about why it was that they didn't actually give a little bit, why their employer didn't give a little bit of help to the employees, how the employer came to take the decision they did, and so on. And I think we've forgotten that actually the world in 2020 is going to be a very different place from the world in 2015 or 14.
I think building on that as well is the employers will need to be able to forecast their business, to your very point, 2018 and beyond going forwards. So we've worked very heavily because a lot of the feedback was, so what does this mean to our business? It's easier to look now, but obviously the different contribution rates as they escalate up. So that was really quite critical for them. So we assist in that. But to your point as well earlier, Henry, about what's in it for the advisors as well. We've worked closely to make an advisor referral model. So if they were to refer resulting business to ourselves, we will actually reward them on an ongoing basis as well, because they are finding it difficult. At Martin's point as well about you've got to be very cost sensitive, especially in that space. So we've taken that decision to deliberately do that and provide like a dedicated team to support these advisors, because it's a crucial linchpin for those customers.
But again, getting it back to income, I think the real advantage of something like that for the advisor and the employer relationship is that they've got a trusted model that says my client will actually get a pension linked to payroll, all sorted out within a week or two. If I'm late for staging, that's really reassuring, rather than the welcome. But
absolutely, and it's a lot of our research with advisors as well. It's also simplicity, peace of mind. It's almost the same for the employer, isn't it? Yeah. It's that actually I want to be able to trust the payroll provider, the pensions provider, that this is actually nice and simple. Yeah, my value is in the advice and guidance, and perhaps some project management in certain cases. But actually they want to make it really simple, so it's peace of mind for the advisor as well.
It's a really important point. If this goes wrong and employees find that their employers have been incompetent in the process, then there's a lot to be lost for the employer. I mean, it's not just the fines that are coming, it's the lack of respect they get from their employees and the loss of confidence, if you like, in their competence. So there's a lot to be lost, and that's why for advisors it's really helpful to be there as the trusted person who makes it all happen. Advisors should really be credited, I think, when it does go right. I'm sure it will go right 99% of the time, but that's the way it goes.
I think that's a good place to finish. I'd just like to thank all our panellists for joining us today. An online version of this, an on-demand version of this will be available within the next 24 hours. Thank you for watching.